While gun control freaks are jumping up and down over events that are happening in a country that is an ocean, an equator, and an international dateline away, as if that has some sort of bearing over affairs here, I'm going to focus instead on something a little bit more domestic. Let me make it clear that I believe that the Second Amendment is for everyone. White, brown, male, female, right, left, straight, gay, religious, irreligious. It doesn't matter what you are. If you are exercising the right safely and responsibly, you have a friend with me. That said, I am becoming less and less impressed with left-wing militias. The John Brown Gun Club has ties with Antifa, for example, and certain members of it have not made a really good showing of themselves. There was that security detail, for example, who assaulted a journalist who happened to be gay, Asian, and something of a lefty himself. Earlier on, they also assaulted a lefty journo who was filming them en route to a MAGA event. The founder of another left-wing community defense group was shot after pulling a gun on 2 cops at a school. And a Huey P. Newton Gun Club founder said that Micah Xavier Johnson would one day be celebrated. Whether or not these are just bad apples ruining the legitimacy of left-wing citizen militia organizations, or whether or not it is just a symptom of the violence that was prescribed by Marx himself, I'll leave others to debate. But this much is certain. The political left seems to have a hard time coming up with really good role models or symbolic figures to inspire themselves with. Whether it be Mao Zedong, who after instilling gun control in his country killed millions in his Great Leap Forward, or Che Guevara, who was a murdering rapist and whose attitudes towards blacks and gays should have blacklisted him from the left-wing halls of fame a long time ago. And it seems that the John Brown Gun Club and the Redneck Revolt really haven't put a whole lot of thought into choosing their namesakes. The left loves pointing out inconvenient and devastating details about the symbols its opponents embrace. The Confederate flag is racist and flown by losers. Christopher Gadsden was a slave owner and therefore racist. As if this is incontrovertible evidence of some sort of inherent moral shortcoming of the people who use these symbols, even if they're using them for completely different purposes. But the race card is a very convenient way of dismissing people with political inclinations that you might find undesirable. Yet, they don't give their own symbols the same level of scrutiny. Should the symbols associated with the new Black Panther Party be considered racist because the SPLC and ADL considers that organization racist? And, of course, there are problems with their own iconic figures. I've already mentioned Mao Zedong and Che Guevara, but there's also some problems with the namesake of the John Brown Gun Club. John Brown, while renowned as a zealous abolitionist, also adopted a much more militant approach to the issue than his more pacifist peers, say, like Frederick Douglass, who saw in Brown the direction that the slavery issue was going, from civility to civil war. He often agitated for violent means to the cause of free states, and moving to Kansas took it upon himself to slaughter 5 pro-slavery families in what was known as the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre, which set off Bleeding, Kansas. His plan to lead an incursion into Virginia and free its slaves sounded good in theory, raiding the armory at Harper's Ferry and using it to arm what he hoped to be a growing number of liberated slaves. Unfortunately, his efforts were undermined in part by Frederick Douglass, who disapproved of Brown's methods and discouraged blacks from joining Brown's raid. And therefore, Brown started off with a much smaller force than he had originally anticipated. While the raid on the armory was successful, things went south afterwards, although not the way that Brown had originally intended. A train came through, and in the interests of maintaining operational security, Brown and his men stopped it. In the encounter, Brown's men opened fire on. In a twist of irony, the first casualty of Brown's war on slavery was a freed black man, and 2 slaves among the hostages that Brown had acquired during his raid on Harper's Ferry. For some strange reason, Brown let it go, and as you would expect it would, it warned its station in Baltimore. In the meantime, some of the locals who were alarmed by all the hubbub going on banded together in a sort of informal militia and contained Brown's raiders until government troops could arrive. And they did, in the form of a company of U.S. Marines under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Israel Green, who himself was under the command of the man who had overall military authority in the region, namely a general by the name of Robert E. Lee. Brown was captured, put on trial, and later hanged. His character is still debated today. Was he a revolutionary or just a terrorist? But given progressive's penchant for tearing down beloved icons at the slightest of faults, I find it very hypocritical that they would canonize a murderous, treasonous figure like John Brown. Then we got the Rednecks, from which the Redneck Revolt gets its name. They adopted the term in part because in 1921, the term became synonymous with armed insurrection against capitalists and the state, as members of the United Mine Workers of America tied red bandanas around their necks during the Battle of Blair Mountain, a 2-week-long armed labor uprising in the coal fields of West Virginia. Now, this lies close to some family history of mine, since generations of my family have lived in the area, and the story involves a distant cousin of mine, Sid Hatfield, who was chief of police in Matewan during the Coal Wars. Given progressive romanticism over class struggles, it's easy to see why the Coal Wars would hold so much appeal for them. It's the classic workers versus bourgeoisie story of mine workers and their unions versus the mine operators and their agents. But the actions of the Rednecks at Blair Mountain had deleterious effects for mine unions. An abbreviated history goes something like this. Miners were being exploited, which prompted socialist organizations to get the miners to organize. Anti-union forces and their allies, such as the Baldwin Felts Agency, were active in discouraging these efforts, such as breaking strikes and intimidating the miners via harassment and even murder. Not to say that pro-union forces were noble and clean. Conflicts between pro and anti-union forces led to low-level warfare all up and down the Tug River Valley, including armed union assaults on non-union mines. This led to the implementation of a sort of martial law, which was seen as being levied mostly against the miners. In the midst of all this, Sid Hatfield, who had become something of a local hero for siding with the unions during this conflict, was shot and killed trying to keep a courtroom appointment to hear charges on what today would be considered terrorist activity. This led the miners to militarize themselves further. Attempts to get the governor to intervene on behalf of the miners failed, and there was talk of rallying the miners together and marching on Mingo County to free the miners from martial law. During this time, a socialist activist by the name of Mary Harris Jones, also known as Mother Jones, and whose name is celebrated by a left-wing magazine today, even though she supported the cause of the miners, she protested the use of force to get those mines to unionize. But the march was already underway. The battle started in earnest on August 25, 1921, and occasionally featured private planes flying over pro-union positions and dropping homemade bombs on them. Anti-union forces, while smaller, were better equipped and held superior positions on the terrain, and in the end suffered fewer casualties than pro-union forces. The West Virginia National Guard was called in to command the men that were fighting against the Union miners. Later, federal troops would be called in, and upon their impending arrival, the leader of the Union forces, Bill Blizzard, told his men to start heading home. By the time federal troops arrived, those that remained surrendered. In the end, some 985 miners went to trial, some facing murder charges, some facing charges of treason against the state of West Virginia. Some were acquitted. But the biggest twist of irony in this entire conflict was how much mining union membership suffered as a result of it. Membership fell from 50,000 to 10,000 in only a few short years, with effects being felt in places like Kentucky and Pennsylvania. And it got to the point that only Illinois remained as the state that was unionized under the UMWA. Some would point out how, in a manner of speaking, it was actually something of a victory because it exposed the working conditions in the mines. And it did help Mother Jones get out from under house arrest because she was charged with conspiracy for her work with the union miners. The entire conflagration did serve to convince unions that it was better to try matters through legal means rather than by force. And that, to me, is a much more important lesson to take home. And it is a lesson that I hope left-wing militias take to heart as well, despite the prescriptions for violence that are at the foundations of Marxism. Armed resistance is a last resort, a doomsday provision, as mentioned by Judge Kaczynski in a dissenting opinion to the 2003 Silveria versus Lockyer decision. My excellent colleagues have forgotten these bitter lessons of history. The prospect of tyranny may not grab the headlines the way vivid stories of gun crime routinely do, but few saw the Third Reich coming until it was too late. The Second Amendment is a doomsday provision, one designed for those exceptionally rare circumstances where all other rights have failed, where government refuses to stand for re-election and silences those who protest, where courts have lost the courage to oppose, or can find no one to enforce their decrees. However improbable these contingencies may seem today, facing them unprepared is a mistake a free people get to make only once. And this was seen in the Bundy Ranch standoff. A long-standing agreement between the Bundys and the authorities over grazing rights was violated by a federal agency which, as I see it, was leveraged by the Obama administration to enact an environmentalist agenda. And it reached a peak in the famous face-off between the Bundys and their allies and federal agents, with federal agents backing down. But bear in mind, not a shot was fired. Militias that gathered in support of the Bundys took up a defensive stance, not an aggressive one. And this was a very tactically sound move, and one that I think best reflects a militia acting in the interest of the security of a free state. In the end, the Bundys were exonerated, and the Second Amendment was demonstrated efficacious for standing up to a government that oversteps its bounds, despite the left's insistence that armed citizens can't possibly stand up to the federal government. But I can understand their skepticism. Two of the more militant American heroes were foiled by government troops, after all. But there is a stark contrast between standing your ground, as was the case at Bundy Ranch, and making preemptive crusades against private citizens, communities, and entities, as was the case with John Brown and the red kerchiefed Union miners in West Virginia. This latter approach does not make you look like a revolutionary. At the very worst, it makes you look like a terrorist. And at the very least, it makes you look like an angry brat, neither of which is helpful to winning the hearts and minds of the people you need to convince the most.